Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey into ancient Babylon, around 1800 BCE. Tonight we'll discover how our earliest civilizations imagined the world might end, alongside people who lived when writing was still young, and every tablet held precious knowledge. Whether you're settling into bed or already drifting toward deep sleep, I'm grateful you're here to explore these quiet corners of history with me. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps from a cozy bedroom, or maybe you're travelling somewhere far from home. It's a lovely thought, all of us finding our way to deep sleep through these ancient stories from long ago. In the cool pre-dawn hours of a Mesopotamian morning, young Enlil Bani carefully arranged his reed stylus and smoothed the surface of a fresh clay tablet, unaware that today he would begin uncovering humanity's oldest fears about how everything might end. The morning air in the temple library carried the familiar scent of damp clay and burning sesame oil from the small lamps that flickered along the walls. Enlil Bani had arrived before the sun touched the eastern horizon, as was his custom. The silence of these early hours suited his temperament perfectly. No bustling of merchants in the courtyard below, no chatter of other scribes, just the gentle whisper of his breathing and the soft scratch of reed against clay. He was 23 years old, though in this time before birthdays were carefully tracked, he measured his age by the floods of the great rivers. He had seen 23 spring floods, 23 times when the Euphrates swelled beyond its banks and deposited rich, dark soil across the barley fields. His father had been a scribe before him, and his grandfather too, stretching back through generations of men who had devoted their lives to the patient work of preserving words in clay. The morning ritual never varied. First, Enlil Bani would check the oil levels in each lamp, trimming the wicks that had grown too long during the night. The flames cast dancing shadows across hundreds of tablets that lined the walls on wooden shelves, each one carefully catalogued according to its contents. There were tablets containing laws, others recording grain transactions, still others preserving the epic tales of heroes and gods. The collection had grown for generations, and Enlil Bani often wondered if he would live long enough to read even half of what surrounded him. After tending the lamps, he would select the tablets assigned for copying that day. The head librarian, an ancient man named Naburimut whose beard had turned white decades ago, would leave instructions written on a small clay tablet near the entrance. Today's assignment was different from the usual legal documents and merchant records that typically crossed his writing surface. The instruction tablet read, "Copy and preserve tablets concerning the ending of all things, various sources, handle with great care, consult Anubel Shunu if questions arise." Enlil Bani read the instructions twice, running his finger along the cuneiform marks pressed into the clay surface. Tablets concerning the ending of all things. In all his years of copying, he had never encountered such a collection. He knew, of course, that there were stories about great floods and angry gods, but he had assumed these were scattered tales, not worthy of a dedicated copying project. The morning light was beginning to filter through the high windows of the library, casting long rectangles of pale gold across the floor. Enlil Bani made his way to the section Naburimut had indicated, his bare feet silent on the smooth stone floor. The tablets here were older than most, their surfaces bearing the slightly different style of cuneiform that marked them as coming from earlier generations of scribes. He selected the first tablet from the designated shelf and carried it carefully back to his writing station. The clay was harder than usual, baked to a deep brown that spoke of great age. As he began to read, his stylus poised over his own fresh tablet, Enlil Bani found himself entering a world he had never imagined. The first text spoke of waters rising to cover all the earth, of a man named Ziusudra, who built a great boat to save his family and the animals of the world. But this was not the version of the flood story he'd heard whispered among the other scribes. This account was older, more detailed, filled with specific measurements for the boat and careful descriptions of how the waters rose day by day. As he copied each symbol, Enlil Bani found his movements slowing. Usually his hand moved across the clay with practiced efficiency. his mind barely registering the meaning of the words as he focused on their accurate reproduction. But these words seemed to demand his attention, drawing him into visions of a world drowning beneath endless rain. The text described how Ziusudra sealed his boat with bitumen, the same black sticky substance that Enlil-Bani had seen workers use to waterproof the temple's foundation. He could almost smell the sharp, acrid odour of the heated pitch, could imagine the desperate urgency of those final preparations as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. By mid-morning, when the temple began to fill with the sounds of daily activity, Enlil-Bani had finished copying the flood account and moved on to the second tablet in the collection. This one was even older, its surface worn smooth in places where countless fingers had traced the ancient symbols. The text spoke of a great serpent that would one day swallow the sun, plunging the world into eternal darkness. The language was different here, using older forms of words that Enlil-Bani had to puzzle over carefully. The scribes who had first pressed these symbols into clay had lived in a time when writing itself was still new, when each character was a small work of art rather than the quick, efficient marks that modern scribes used. He found himself admiring the careful precision of those ancient writers, even as their words filled him with a strange unease. According to this tablet, the great serpent lived in the deepest part of the underworld, coiled around the roots of the world tree that held up the heavens. Each day, the serpent grew a little larger, fed by the darkness of human fears and the shadows cast by evil deeds. When it finally grew large enough, it would unwind itself from the tree's roots and surge upward, its massive jaws opening wide enough to swallow the sun itself. Enlil-Bani paused in his copying to stretch his cramped fingers and sip from a cup of barley beer that had grown warm in the morning heat. Through the high windows he could see the sun climbing toward its noon position, its familiar light streaming across his work surface. The idea that such a reliable, constant presence could simply disappear seemed impossible, yet the ancient scribe who had written these words had believed it completely. The third tablet spoke of a time when the gods themselves would grow old and tired, when their strength would fail, and their attention would wander from human affairs. Without divine protection, the text explained, the forces of chaos that had existed before creation would return to claim the world. Mountains would crumble into dust, rivers would flow backward, and the careful order that separated earth from sky would collapse into primordial confusion. As he worked through the morning hours, copying symbol after symbol, Enlil-Bani began to notice patterns in these ancient fears. Water featured prominently, not just the Great Flood, but also accounts of rivers running dry, of the great sea boiling away to leave nothing but cracked earth and bleached bones. Fire appeared repeatedly too, sometimes as a cleansing force sent by angry gods, other times as a wild destruction that would consume everything humans had built. The most unsettling accounts, though, were those that spoke of gradual endings, of crops that would slowly stop growing, of children who would be born weaker than their parents, of knowledge that would be forgotten bit by bit until humanity returned to the ignorance of wild beasts. These texts contained no dramatic moments of destruction, no divine intervention or cosmic catastrophe. Instead, they described a slow fade, an almost gentle dissolution of everything that made civilization possible. By the time the sun reached its highest point, casting short shadows in the courtyard below, Enlil-Bani had copied portions of 7 different tablets, each one presenting a different vision of how the world might end. His hand was beginning to cramp from the unfamiliar intensity of concentration these texts demanded, and his shoulders ached from hunching over his work surface. He set down his stylus and walked to one of the high windows, gazing out over the familiar landscape of his city. The great ziggurat rose in the distance, its stepped sides gleaming in the noon sun. Below in the streets, merchants called out their wares, children chased each other between the houses, and women carried water jars balanced perfectly on their heads. Everything appeared exactly as it had every day of his life, solid, permanent, eternal. Yet the words he had been copying all morning whispered of the fragility beneath this apparent permanence. These ancient scribes, men much like himself who had spent their days preserving knowledge in clay, had looked at their own thriving cities and imagined them reduced to dust and memory. What had they seen that he was missing? What signs had they read in the movement of stars or the behaviour of animals that convinced them to preserve these dark prophecies? Enlil Bani returned to his workstation and selected another tablet from the collection. This one was different from the others, smaller, made of finer clay, with symbols pressed so deeply into its surface that they created tiny shadows in the afternoon light. The text began with an invocation to Marduk, the great god of Babylon, asking for wisdom to understand the patterns that governed the rise and fall of civilizations. According to this tablet, the world moved in great cycles, like the seasons but vastly longer. Each cycle lasted thousands of years, beginning with a golden age when gods and humans lived in harmony, when the earth produced abundant crops without need for labour, when death was unknown and sorrow had no meaning. Gradually this golden age would give way to silver, then bronze, then iron, each age bringing more hardship, more conflict, more distance between the divine and mortal realms. The Iron Age, in which the tablet's author claimed to be living, would be the last and darkest period of the cycle. It would end not with a single catastrophic event, but with a gradual exhaustion of the world's vital energy. The earth would grow tired of producing life, the gods would withdraw their attention, and slowly, inevitably, everything would wind down like a water clock whose reservoir had finally emptied. But this ending, the text assured its readers, was not permanent. After a period of darkness and rest, a new golden age would begin, fresh and pure as the first dawn. The cycle would start again, with new gods, new humans, new possibilities for joy and creation. The ending was not truly an ending at all, but a necessary pause before renewal. This idea fascinated Enlil Bani in a way that the more violent apocalyptic visions had not. He found himself copying these passages with extra care, pressing his stylus deeply into the clay to ensure that every symbol would be preserved clearly. There was something comforting about the notion that even the most complete destruction was temporary, that the patterns of creation were too strong to be permanently broken. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the library floor, Enlil Bani realised that he had only begun to explore the collection Nabu Rimut had assigned to him. The tablets he'd examined so far represented just a small portion of what appeared to be an extensive archive of apocalyptic beliefs and prophecies. Some of the remaining tablets appeared to be written in scripts he didn't recognise, possibly records from other cities, other kingdoms, other peoples entirely. The thought both thrilled and intimidated him. Each tablet represented weeks or months of careful copying work, and many would require consultation with other scholars to decipher their more obscure passages. This was not the kind of routine copying assignment he was accustomed to, but rather a scholarly project that could occupy months or even years of his life. As he prepared to end his workday, carefully covering his unfinished tablets with damp cloths to keep the clay workable, Enlil Bani found his mind returning again and again to the question that had emerged during his morning's reading. What had motivated these ancient scribes to preserve such dark visions of the future? Were they responding to specific threats, invasions, famines, plagues that had made the end of their world seem imminent and real? Or had they been driven by some deeper human need to imagine boundaries, to conceive of endings in order to give meaning to beginnings? As he walked home through the familiar streets of Babylon, passing the same shops and houses he had known all his life, Enlil Bani wondered what future scribes might make of his own peaceful, ordinary world, and what endings they might imagine for the civilization that seemed so permanent beneath his feet. Chapter 2. Deciphering the Clay Tablets. Afternoon Studies. The next afternoon found Enlil Bani seated in the same corner of the library, but his approach to the work had changed. Where yesterday he had copied with the mechanical precision of routine, Today he found himself pausing frequently to consider the meanings hidden within the ancient symbols. The morning's work had left him with more questions than answers, and he had spent a restless night dreaming of rising waters and serpents that devoured light. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows at a different angle than the morning light, casting new shadows across the tablets arranged before him. Enlil Bani had arrived early again, but this time he had brought with him several reference tablets from other sections of the library, lexicons and symbol guides that might help him decipher some of the more obscure passages he had encountered. Today's selection included tablets that appeared to come from far beyond Babylon's borders. The clay itself was different. Some pieces fired to an unusual reddish hue that suggested different earth, different kilns, different hands that had shaped them. The cuneiform marks, while recognisable, showed subtle variations in style that marked them as foreign copies of foreign thoughts. The first tablet he examined bore symbols he recognised as coming from the northern kingdoms, where the winters grew cold enough to freeze the rivers solid. The text spoke of an ending that would come not through fire or flood, but through ice, a gradual cooling of the world that would spread southward like a slow-moving tide, turning green fields into barren tundra and driving all living things before it into an ever-shrinking band of warmth near the southern seas. As he copied these words, Enlil Bani tried to imagine what ice might look like. He had seen hail during the worst storms, pellets of hard water that bounced off rooftops and melted quickly in the heat. But the tablet described something far more permanent. Water that turned solid and stayed that way, covering rivers so completely that people could walk across them, accumulating in drifts higher than a man's head. The northern scribe who had composed this text wrote with the authority of someone who had witnessed such conditions. He described the way trees would crack when the cold reached a certain intensity, splitting open with sounds like thunder. He wrote of animals whose fur grew so thick they looked like walking carpets, and of people who learned to build houses from blocks of ice that were stronger than sun-dried brick. But even these hardy northern people, the text explained, would eventually be overwhelmed. The ice would continue its advance year by year, until even the warmest southern regions began to freeze. The last humans would huddle around the final fires, burning their furniture, their books, finally their houses themselves, until nothing remained but empty cold and silence. Enlil Bani set down his stylus and rubbed his eyes. The afternoon heat that filled the library seemed suddenly precious, a warmth he had never appreciated properly. He rose and walked to the window, letting the familiar sounds of the busy courtyard below remind him that the world remained very much alive and thriving. When he returned to his work, he selected a tablet that came from the opposite direction. These southern lands where palm trees grew and traders spoke of cities built on islands in vast bodies of water. This text painted an ending that was the inverse of the ice prophecy, a world that would grow steadily hotter until the very air became too scorching to breathe. According to this southern account, the sun would gradually move closer to the earth, drawn by some cosmic force that even the gods could not resist. At first, the change would be subtle, summers that lasted a little longer, winters that brought less relief. But eventually the heat would become unbearable. Rivers would boil away to nothing, leaving only cracked beds lined with the bones of fish. Trees would burst into flame spontaneously, and even stones would become too hot to touch. The final generations of humanity would be forced to live underground, digging deeper and deeper burrows to escape the killing heat above. They would emerge only at night, scavenging for food in a landscape transformed into a furnace. Eventually, even the deepest caves would become ovens, and the last humans would die gasping in superheated air, their bodies mummified instantly by the brutal temperature. What struck Enlil Bani as he copied these contrasting visions was how each seemed to reflect the specific fears of its homeland. The northern scribes, who lived with winter's bite, imagined an ending through ultimate cold. The southern writers, familiar with drought and scorching heat, envisioned death by fire. Each group had taken their most familiar hardship and magnified it into a cosmic catastrophe. This pattern became even clearer as he worked through the afternoon, examining tablets from regions he could barely locate on the crude maps that adorned the library walls. Coastal peoples wrote of great waves that would rise higher than mountains, swallowing entire continents beneath the sea. Desert dwellers described sandstorms that would last for decades, burying every trace of civilization beneath dunes that reached to the clouds. Mountain folk preserved accounts of the earth itself splitting open, of great chasms that would swallow cities and peoples whole. Plains dwellers wrote of winds that would blow without ceasing, growing stronger each year until they stripped away soil, vegetation, buildings, everything that was not bedrock. Yet within this diversity of apocalyptic visions, Enlil-bani began to notice certain recurring themes. Almost every account spoke of warnings that would precede the final catastrophe, signs that the wise could read if they knew what to look for. Animals would behave strangely, migrating at the wrong times or refusing to migrate at all. Plants would flower out of season, or familiar crops would suddenly fail to grow properly. The sky would display unusual colours, particularly at dawn and sunset. Stars would appear in new positions, or familiar constellations would fade from view. The weather would become erratic, with seasons arriving early or late, with rain falling during the dry months and drought occurring when floods were expected. Most significantly, the texts agree that human behaviour would itself become a sign of approaching doom. People would grow selfish and cruel, caring nothing for their neighbours or their children's future. Laws would be ignored, traditions abandoned, and the bonds that held communities together would dissolve into mistrust and violence. This last point troubled Enlil-bani more than the physical catastrophes described in the tablets. Floods, fires, and earthquakes were forces beyond human control. Acts of gods or nature that mortals could only endure. But the breakdown of human decency seemed like something that people themselves could choose to prevent or allow. He thought of his own city, of the merchants who sometimes cheated in their measurements, of the officials who demanded extra payments for services that should have been provided freely. Were these the first symptoms of the moral decay that would herald the world's end? Or were they simply the ordinary failings that had always existed among people, no worse in his time than in any other? As the afternoon progressed, Enlil-bani encountered tablets that offered more specific timeframes for these predicted endings. Some spoke in terms of generations. The world would end when the children of the current children had children of their own. Others provided elaborate calculations based on the movements of stars and planets, predicting catastrophe when certain celestial alignments occurred. One particularly detailed tablet, written in the precise script of an astronomer priest, calculated that the world's end would come exactly 260 years after the founding of the first city. The scribe had carefully worked out this timeline by correlating various astronomical cycles with historical records, creating a complex formula that filled several columns of tiny cuneiform marks. Enlil-bani found himself both impressed by the mathematical sophistication of this approach and sceptical of its underlying assumptions. How could anyone know exactly when the first city had been founded? And even if such a date could be established, what cosmic principle would link urban development to universal destruction? Yet he copied the calculations faithfully, recognizing that regardless of their accuracy, they represented a serious attempt by learned people to understand the patterns that governed existence. These ancient scholars had devoted years of study to questions that had no easy answers, driven by the same curiosity about the fundamental nature of reality that motivated his own work. As the shadows in the library grew longer, indicating that evening was approaching, Enlil-bani came across a tablet that was different from all the others he had examined. Instead of describing a single catastrophic ending, this text presented what its author called the doctrine of multiple endings, the idea that the world had already ended many times and would end many times again. According to this radical theory, what people mistook for the permanent world was actually just the most recent in a series of worlds each one built on the ruins of its predecessor. The great flood that featured in so many of the apocalyptic texts had not been a unique event, but simply the most recent in a cycle of destructions that stretched back through countless ages. Evidence for this theory, the tablet claimed, could be found everywhere for those who knew how to look. Deep beneath the earth lay the remains of cities and peoples that had existed before the current world began. Strange objects made of unfamiliar materials sometimes emerge from old ruins, tools and ornaments that no living person knew how to create. Even more intriguingly, the text suggested that fragmentary memories of these previous worlds survived in dreams, in ancient songs whose meanings had been forgotten, and in certain recurring nightmares that plagued humanity across all cultures. The fear of endings that drove people to preserve apocalyptic prophecies was itself a memory, a dim recollection of the times when their world had actually ended. This idea fascinated Enlil-bani even as it unsettled him. If the author was correct, then the very tablets he was copying represented not prophecies of future disasters, but records of past experiences, warnings based on actual knowledge rather than fearful speculation. The scribes who had first composed these texts might have been preserving genuine historical accounts, passed down through generations of survivors who had lived through the end of their world and the beginning of the next. As he prepared to conclude his afternoon's work, carefully arranging the completed tablets in order and covering his work surface with the damp cloths that would keep the clay workable overnight, Enlil-bani found himself wondering about the true purpose of the collection he was copying. Had Naburimut simply wanted these ancient texts preserved for their historical value, or was there some more immediate purpose behind the project? Were current conditions in Babylon or the surrounding region giving rise to concerns that these old prophecies might be relevant once again? As he walked home through streets that glowed golden in the setting sun, Enlil-bani noticed details he had never paid attention to before. The way some of the older buildings showed subtle signs of settling and decay, the increasing number of beggars who gathered near the temple gates, the worried conversations he overheard between merchants discussing failed harvests in distant provinces. Perhaps the signs mentioned in the ancient tablets were not as remote and academic as he had initially assumed. Perhaps the scholarly project he had undertaken was more urgent than a simple exercise in historical preservation. But what could a young scribe possibly do with such knowledge, and who would believe him if he tried to share the warnings he was uncovering in the ancient texts? Chapter 3. The Elders' Tales, Evening Conversations. That evening, instead of returning directly to his modest quarters near the temple complex, Enlil-bani found himself walking toward the oldest section of the city, where narrow streets wound between houses that had been built when his grandfather's grandfather was young. The weight of the day's discoveries pressed on his mind like a physical burden, and he felt an urgent need to speak with someone who might help him make sense of what he was uncovering. The person he sought was Anu-bel-Shunu, the elderly scholar whom Naburimut had mentioned in his instructions. Enlil-bani had encountered the old man only a few times in the temple library, always hunched over tablets written in script so ancient that few living people could read them. Anu-bel-Shunu was said to be nearly 70 years old, an almost unimaginable age that placed him among the most venerable scholars in all of Babylon. The old man's house stood at the end of a street so narrow that two people could barely pass each other between the walls. The building itself was ancient, constructed of sun-dried bricks that had weathered to a soft grey colour, with a wooden door that had been polished smooth by decades of hands. A small oil lamp flickered in a niche beside the entrance, casting dancing shadows on the worn stone threshold. Enlil-bani knocked softly, uncertain whether such an impromptu visit would be welcome. From within came the sound of shuffling footsteps, and after a long moment the door opened to reveal a man whose white beard reached nearly to his waist. Anu-bel-Shunu's eyes, though clouded with age, remained sharp and intelligent, and they studied the young scribe with unmistakable curiosity. "Enlil-bani, son of Marduk-Nasir," the old man said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone accustomed to choosing words with great care. "You are working on the collection of endings, are you not? I have been wondering when you would come to see me." The young scribe was surprised to be recognised so readily, and even more surprised that his current assignment was already known to the scholar. "Yes, master. I've spent 2 days copying the tablets, and I find myself troubled by what I am reading. I hoped you might help me understand the purpose of preserving such dark prophecies." Anu-Bel-Shunu stepped back from the doorway, gesturing for his visitor to enter. "Come in, young man. The evening is growing cool, and these old bones prefer the warmth of the hearth. We have much to discuss, and the night is long enough for proper conversation." The interior of the house was unlike any dwelling Enlil-Bani had ever seen. Every wall was lined with shelves, and every shelf was filled with tablets, scrolls, and objects whose purposes he could not immediately identify. Oil lamps burned in numerous niches, filling the space with warm, flickering light that made the cuneiform symbols on nearby tablets seem to dance and shift before his eyes. Anu-Bel-Shunu led him to a low table surrounded by cushions, where a simple meal of barley bread, dates, and watered wine had been set out. "Sit," the old man instructed, lowering himself carefully onto a cushion with the deliberate movements of someone whose joints no longer bent easily. "Tell me what you have discovered in your copying, and what questions it has raised in your mind." Enlil-Bani accepted a cup of the diluted wine and took a moment to organise his thoughts. The tablets speak of many different endings: flood, fire, ice, earthquake. Each seems to reflect the fears of the people who wrote it, but I cannot understand why such knowledge would be preserved, or why Nabu-Ramit has assigned me to copy it all so carefully. The old scholar nodded slowly, breaking off a piece of bread and chewing it thoughtfully before responding. "You're asking the right questions, young one. But before I can help you understand the answers, you must first tell me, do you believe these prophecies describe real events, or do you think them merely the product of fearful imagination?" The question caught Enlil-Bani off guard. He had been so focused on the mechanical work of copying that he had not fully considered the fundamental issue of whether the texts contained truth or fiction. I am not certain. Some of the details seem too specific to be entirely imagined. The measurements for the Flood Hero's boat, the astronomical calculations predicting catastrophe. But the events themselves seem impossible. "Impossible," Anu-Bel-Shunu repeated, tasting the word as if it were wine. "That is an interesting choice of words. Tell me, do you think it impossible that a great flood might cover the earth? Have you never seen the spring floods that transform the landscape, turning familiar fields into temporary seas?" "Of course I have seen floods," Enlil-Bani replied, "but the tablets speak of waters that cover the highest mountains, that persist for months without receding. Surely that goes beyond what nature can accomplish." The old man's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. "Ah, but that assumes you understand the full scope of what nature can accomplish. Come with me, young scribe. There is something I wish to show you." Anu-Bel-Shunu rose with careful dignity and led Enlil-Bani to a section of the house where the largest tablets were stored. These were not the standard size used for most documents, but massive slabs that required both hands to lift safely. The old scholar selected one and carried it to a reading stand, adjusting the nearby lamps to provide better illumination. "This tablet was made by my grandfather's teacher," he explained, running his fingers along the ancient symbols. "It records observations made during the Great Flood that occurred 93 years ago. Not the mythical flood of the hero stories, but an actual event that was witnessed and documented by scholars of that time." Enlil-Bani leaned forward to examine the text, immediately recognising the older style of cuneiform that marked it as genuinely ancient. The account was written in the precise observational language of scientific documentation, rather than the poetic style of mythical narratives. It described water levels rising far beyond any previously recorded flood, engulfing not just the usual flood plains, but reaching levels that covered the lower stories of buildings in elevated areas of the city. "The flood lasted for 47 days, Anu-Bel-Shunu continued, pointing to the relevant passage. "During that time, the normal boundaries between land and water completely disappeared. Boats sailed over the rooftops of houses. Fish were caught in the branches of trees. People who had never seen the ocean found themselves living temporarily on what amounted to a vast inland sea. The young scribe studied the tablet with growing amazement. The level of detail was extraordinary. Measurements of water depth taken at specific locations, observations of how different materials responded to prolonged submersion, even notes about changes in the behaviour of birds and animals during the crisis. But this describes conditions that lasted for weeks, not months, he pointed out, and it covers only our immediate region, not the entire Earth. True, the old man acknowledged, but consider this. If such an event could occur within living memory, witnessed and documented by reliable observers, how much greater might be the floods that occur only once in many generations? And if the waters can rise high enough to transform our familiar landscape so completely, might they not rise even higher under more extreme circumstances? Enlil Bani felt his understanding of the tablets he had been copying begin to shift. Perhaps the apocalyptic accounts were not pure fantasy, but rather extrapolations from real experiences, attempts by ancient peoples to imagine the ultimate expression of natural forces they had already witnessed in lesser forms. You begin to see, Anu-Bel-Shunu said, apparently reading the comprehension in his visitor's expression. The prophecies of ending are not arbitrary fears, but reasoned projections based on careful observation of natural patterns. Every culture experiences disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes, plagues. The apocalyptic traditions represent attempts to understand the ultimate limits of such processes. The old scholar returned the tablet to its place and selected another, this one dealing with astronomical observations. Consider the accounts of cosmic catastrophe that you've been copying. The scribes who composed them were not ignorant peasants frightened by eclipses, but trained observers who had spent lifetimes studying the movements of celestial bodies. This tablet contained records of unusual astronomical events spanning several centuries, eclipses that lasted longer than expected, stars that appeared and disappeared without warning, years when familiar constellations seemed to shift their position slightly. The observations were recorded with the same careful precision as the flood documentation, complete with dates and detailed descriptions of exactly what had been witnessed. These ancient astronomers noticed that the heavens were not as perfectly regular as people commonly assumed, Anu-Bel-Shunu explained. They saw that changes could occur, that the cosmic order was not absolutely fixed and unchanging. From these observations they reasoned that larger changes might also be possible, perhaps even changes dramatic enough to threaten the stability of the world itself. As the evening progressed, the old scholar showed Enlil Bani tablet after tablet, documenting various forms of natural disaster and unusual phenomena. There were accounts of earthquakes so severe they had altered the courses of rivers, of droughts that had lasted for decades, of plagues that had depopulated entire regions. Each event had been carefully recorded by contemporary observers, creating an archive of catastrophes that provided the factual foundation for the more speculative prophecies of ultimate ending. But why preserve such knowledge? Enlil Bani asked as they returned to their seats by the low table. If these events are inevitable, what purpose does it serve to anticipate them? Anu-Bel-Shunu refilled their wine cups and settled back against his cushions before answering. That, young scribe, is perhaps the most important question you could ask. The answer lies not in the prophecies themselves, but in the response they have inspired in those who preserved them. The old man gestured toward the shelves that surrounded them, filled with the accumulated knowledge of generations. Every tablet in this room, every piece of wisdom we have inherited from our ancestors, exists because someone chose to preserve it, despite knowing that all human achievements are temporary. The scholars who documented floods knew that future floods would come. The astronomers who mapped the heavens understood that celestial changes would continue, yet they persisted in their work. Why? Enlil Bani found himself asking, though he suspected he was beginning to understand the answer. Because the act of preservation itself is an act of hope, Anu-Bel-Shunu replied. To carefully record knowledge, to train students to carry on scholarly traditions, to build libraries and maintain them across generations, All of this requires faith that the future will include people capable of appreciating and using what we leave behind. The old scholar paused to sip his wine, his eyes reflecting the lamplight as he gazed into memories of decades spent among ancient texts. The prophecies of ending serve as reminders of the preciousness of what we have built. They teach us not to take our civilization for granted, not to assume that the knowledge and institutions we inherit will automatically survive without conscious effort to preserve them. As the night deepened around them, Anu-Bel-Shunu shared stories he had learned from his own teachers, accounts of libraries that had been lost to fire or flood, of scholarly traditions that had died out when no one took responsibility for continuing them. He spoke of cities that had fallen into ruin not because of dramatic catastrophes, but simply because their inhabitants had grown careless about maintaining the systems that kept civilization functioning. The greatest threat to any world, he said finally, is not the dramatic ending described in the prophecies, but the quiet ending that comes from neglect, from forgetting the value of what previous generations built and preserved. Enlil-Bani listened with growing understanding, recognizing that his work copying the apocalyptic tablets was itself part of this ancient tradition of preservation. Each symbol he pressed into clay was an act of defiance against the forces of forgetting, a small contribution to the great project of maintaining human knowledge across the generations. As he prepared to take his leave, the old scholar walked him to the door and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. Tomorrow, when you return to your copying, remember that you are not merely recording ancient fears, but participating in humanity's greatest achievement, the transmission of wisdom across time. The tablets speak of endings, but your work serves the cause of continuance. Walking home through streets now dark except for the occasional lamp flickering in a doorway, Enlil-Bani felt the weight of his assignment settling into a new configuration in his mind. The prophecies he was copying were not just curiosities from the past, but active warnings, reminders of the fragility that made each day of civilization precious and worthy of careful stewardship. But as he approached his own quarters, a troubling thought began to form. If the apocalyptic traditions were based on real observations and legitimate concerns, how could anyone determine whether the signs they described were beginning to manifest in the present day? And if such signs were indeed appearing, what responsibility did a scholar bear to warn others, even if such warnings might be dismissed as the fears of an overly studious young scribe? Chapter 4. Gathering Ancient Wisdom. Night Preparations. The conversation with Anu-Bel-Shunu had left Enlil-Bani's mind too active for immediate sleep. Instead of retiring to his small chamber, he found himself returning to the temple library, using his privilege as a trusted scribe to enter the building during the quiet hours when most of the city slept. The familiar space felt different in the deep night, more mysterious, filled with shadows that seemed to hold secrets whispered by generations of scholars who had worked here before him. By the light of a single oil lamp, Enlil-Bani began to organize his approach to the remaining tablets in a more systematic way. Anu-Bel-Shunu's insights had shown him that the apocalyptic collection was not simply a random gathering of ancient fears, but a carefully curated archive of observations and reasoned projections. If he was to understand the full scope of what he was copying, he needed to approach the work with the methodical attention of a scholar rather than the mechanical efficiency of a routine copyist. He spent the first hour of the night creating a catalogue of what he had already copied, noting the apparent origin of each text, the type of ending it described, and any specific details that might provide clues about the historical circumstances that had inspired it. The flood accounts, he realized, could be grouped into several distinct categories, some describing gradual inundations that lasted for seasons, others depicting sudden deluges that transformed the landscape in a matter of days. The astronomical prophecies showed similar patterns of variation. Some were based on eclipse cycles and predicted catastrophes that would coincide with specific celestial events. Others described gradual changes in stellar positions that would accumulate over centuries before reaching a critical threshold. A few spoke of entirely new celestial bodies that would appear without warning, disrupting the cosmic order through their unexpected presence. As he worked by lamplight, organising his notes and planning his approach to the uncatalogued tablets, Enlil-Bani became aware of soft footsteps in the corridor outside the library. He looked up from his work, wondering if another scholar had also chosen to work during the night hours, but the footsteps passed without pause and faded into silence. The incident reminded him that he was not entirely alone in the building, even during these quiet hours when the temple complex seemed empty of activity. The realization prompted him to consider more carefully the circumstances surrounding his assignment. Naburimet had not simply asked him to copy a random collection of old tablets, but had specifically directed him to focus on texts dealing with apocalyptic themes. The elderly librarian was known for his methodical approach to preservation work. He rarely assigned projects without clear purposes, and he never wasted the time of skilled scribes on purely academic exercises. Perhaps the current assignment reflected some specific concern or inquiry that had prompted the systematic examination of prophetic literature. Enlil-Bani tried to recall any unusual events or discussions he might have overheard in recent weeks. Conversations among the priests, visits from officials or messengers, changes in the routine activities of the temple complex. But his daily work had kept him so focused on immediate tasks that he had paid little attention to the broader currents of institutional life. Returning his attention to the uncatalogued tablets, Enlil-Bani selected one that appeared different from any he had previously examined. The clay was fired to an unusual hardness, and the cuneiform symbols were pressed unusually deeply into its surface, as if the scribe who created it had wanted to ensure that the text would survive, even if subjected to rough handling or adverse conditions. The opening lines immediately mark this as a text of extraordinary sophistication. Instead of beginning with invocations to gods or references to traditional sources of authority, the tablet opened with a systematic analysis of the logical principles that should govern any attempt to predict future events. The anonymous author had clearly been trained in the most advanced scholarly methods of his time, and he applied these methods to the question of cosmic endings with rigorous intellectual discipline. According to this text, meaningful prophecy required three elements: accurate observation of natural patterns, understanding of the causal principles that govern those patterns, and recognition of the timescales over which significant changes occurred. Most apocalyptic predictions, the author argued, failed because they ignored one or more of these requirements, leading to prophecies that were either too vague to be useful or too specific to be credible. The tablet went on to present what its author called the method of convergent catastrophes, a systematic approach to predicting when multiple natural processes might combine to produce effects more severe than any single process could generate alone. By carefully studying the cycles of flood, drought, earthquake, and other natural phenomena, skilled observers could identify periods when several different types of disaster were likely to occur simultaneously, creating conditions that might indeed threaten the survival of entire civilizations. Enlil-Bani found himself copying this text with unusual care, recognizing that he was preserving not just another prophetic account, but a sophisticated attempt to establish prophecy as a legitimate branch of scholarly inquiry. The author's approach reminded him of the mathematical methods used by astronomer priests to predict eclipses and plan the ritual calendar. Careful observation, systematic analysis, and rigorous logic applied to complex natural phenomena. The tablet included several specific examples of how the convergent catastrophe method might be applied. One detailed calculation predicted that approximately every 400 years, the cycles of major flooding, severe drought in the northern grain-producing regions, and increased earthquake activity along the trade routes would converge to create conditions that could destabilize the political and economic foundations of Mesopotamian civilization. According to the author's timeline, such a convergence had last occurred during the reign of a king whose name Enlil-Bani recognized from historical chronicles, a period remembered for its widespread famines, political upheavals, and the collapse of several previously prosperous cities. The next convergence, if the calculations were correct, was still generations in the future, but the intermediate periods would include lesser convergences that might also pose significant challenges. As he worked through the mathematical details of these predictions, Enlil-Bani began to appreciate the enormous scope of knowledge that would be required to apply such methods effectively. The author had drawn on astronomical data, historical records, geological observations, and economic analysis to create his prophetic framework. No single scholar could possibly master all these fields thoroughly enough to make reliable predictions, which suggested that meaningful prophecy required collaborative effort among specialists from multiple disciplines. This realization prompted him to examine more carefully the remaining tablets in the collection, looking for evidence of such collaborative scholarship. Many of the texts he had initially assumed to be individual compositions now revealed themselves as compilations, drawing together observations and insights from multiple sources. Some tablets explicitly acknowledged their composite nature, listing the various scholars and institutional archives that had contributed to their contents. One particularly impressive example was a tablet that combined flood predictions based on astronomical cycles with detailed maps showing which areas of the city would be most vulnerable to different levels of inundation. The maps had clearly been created by someone with extensive knowledge of drainage patterns, building foundations and underground water systems, while the astronomical calculations required expertise that was typically found only among the temple's most senior priest-scholars. The collaborative nature of these prophetic projects suggested something that had not occurred to Enlil-Bani before: the possibility that his own copying work was part of a larger contemporary effort to gather and synthesize apocalyptic knowledge. Perhaps other scribes in other cities were engaged in similar projects, systematically preserving and organizing prophetic traditions in preparation for some anticipated need. As the night progressed toward dawn, Enlil-Bani encountered tablets that provided indirect evidence for this hypothesis. Several texts included references to the Great Gathering of Wisdom, or the Preservation Project, or similar phrases that seemed to describe organized efforts to collect and preserve knowledge related to catastrophic events. One tablet mentioned specific instructions for scribes engaged in copying apocalyptic materials, emphasizing the importance of preserving even seemingly contradictory accounts and maintaining careful records of the sources and dates of all materials copied. The most intriguing discovery came in a tablet that appeared to be part of a correspondence between scholars in different cities. The text was fragmentary, with portions missing or too worn to read clearly, but the surviving passages indicated that prophetic research was being coordinated across multiple kingdoms and scholarly institutions. References to the tablets from Mari and the calculations received from Ur suggested that knowledge was being shared systematically among widely separated centers of learning. This network of scholarly collaboration helped explain some of the patterns Enlil-Bani had noticed in the apocalyptic collection. The text represented not just the local traditions of Babylon, but a comprehensive survey of prophetic knowledge from across the known world. The project he was working on was apparently part of an ambitious attempt to gather all available wisdom about catastrophic events into a single, accessible archive. But why had such an archive been deemed necessary? As Enlil-Bani prepared to conclude his night's work, carefully arranging the tablets he had examined and making notes about priorities for future copying sessions, he found himself returning to the question that had troubled him since his conversation with Anubel-Shunu. If the apocalyptic traditions contained genuine insights based on careful observation and analysis, then the creation of a comprehensive archive might reflect specific concerns about current conditions rather than merely academic interest in ancient prophecies. The evidence was subtle but suggestive. The tablets he had been copying included several that appeared to have been created quite recently, within his own lifetime or perhaps the generation immediately preceding it. These recent additions to the collection dealt primarily with methods of observation and analysis rather than specific predictions, as if contemporary scholars were more interested in developing tools for understanding prophetic patterns than in generating new prophecies themselves. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the library's high windows, Enlil-Bani realized that his systematic examination of the apocalyptic collection had raised more questions than it had answered. The text clearly represented serious scholarly work based on genuine observations and careful reasoning. The scope and organization of the collection suggested that it was part of a coordinated effort involving multiple institutions and kingdoms, and the inclusion of recent analytical works implied that contemporary scholars had specific reasons for wanting to understand the patterns and principles that governed catastrophic events. But the most troubling question remained unanswered. Were the current preservation efforts purely academic, or did they reflect concerns that the conditions described in the ancient prophecies might be beginning to manifest in the present day? As he extinguished his lamp and prepared to leave the library, Enlil-Bani wondered whether the answers to this question lay hidden somewhere in the remaining tablets, waiting to be discovered by a scribe careful enough to recognize their significance. Chapter 5. The Council of Memories. Dawn Deliberations. Dawn found Enlil-Bani walking slowly through the temple complex, his mind heavy with the weight of discoveries from his night of solitary research. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of the city awakening, merchants calling to early customers, children laughing as they ran errands for their families, the rhythmic pounding of grain being prepared for the day's bread. Yet these ordinary sounds seemed somehow distant to him now, overlaid with echoes of the catastrophic visions he'd been copying day after day. As he approached the library, Enlil-Bani noticed an unusual number of people gathered in the courtyard outside the building. These were not the typical temple visitors, not merchants seeking blessings for their ventures or farmers bringing offerings of grain. Instead, he recognized several elderly scholars from various parts of the city, men whose reputations for learning extended far beyond the temple walls. Some wore the distinctive robes of astronomer priests, others the simpler garments of archive keepers and lexicographers. At the centre of this gathering stood Naburimut, the head librarian, engaged in quiet but intense conversation with a man Enlil-Bani had never seen before. This stranger was clearly from another city, perhaps even another kingdom, as evidenced by the style of his clothing and the particular way he wrapped his headcloth. His presence suggested that whatever had brought these scholars together was a matter of significance that transcended local concerns. Enlil-Bani hesitated at the edge of the courtyard, uncertain whether he should approach or wait for the gathering to disperse. His decision was made for him when Naburimut noticed his arrival, and beckoned him forward with a gesture that suggested his presence was both expected and welcome. "Enlil-Bani," the elderly librarian said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for occasions of particular importance. "Your work on the preservation project has been exemplary. These learned colleagues have expressed interest in hearing about your observations and discoveries during your copying of the apocalyptic collection." The young scribe felt a flutter of nervousness as he found himself the focus of attention from so many distinguished scholars. He had been trained to show proper deference to his elders and superiors, but he had never been asked to report on his work to such an august assembly. The realization that his copying project was apparently connected to whatever had brought these men together added to his sense of being involved in events larger than he had understood. "Tell us," said one of the astronomer priests, a man whose beard was streaked with white, and whose hands bore the ink stains that marked a lifetime of scholarly work. "What patterns have you observed in the texts you have been copying? Do the various prophetic traditions show consistency in their descriptions of signs that would precede catastrophic events?" Enlil-Bani took a moment to organize his thoughts before responding. "Yes, Master. Despite coming from different regions and different periods, the texts show remarkable agreement about certain types of warning signs. They speak consistently of changes in animal behavior, unusual weather patterns, and disruptions in the normal cycles of celestial phenomena." The foreign scholar leaned forward with evident interest. "And have you noticed whether these signs are described as occurring individually, or in specific combinations and sequences?" "The more sophisticated texts describe complex patterns," Enlil-Bani replied, thinking of the convergent catastrophe tablet he had studied during the night. They suggest that isolated anomalies are not significant, but that certain combinations of unusual events might indicate the approach of more serious disruptions. This response prompted an exchange of meaningful glances among several of the assembled scholars. Naborimet gestured for the group to move inside the library, where their conversation could continue without the distraction of increasing activity in the courtyard, as more temple workers arrived for their daily duties. Inside the familiar surroundings of the library, the scholars arranged themselves in a circle near the reading tables where Enlil Bani had been working. The morning light streaming through the high windows illuminated faces marked by years of careful study, men who had devoted their lives to understanding the patterns that governed both earthly and celestial phenomena. "What we're about to share with you," Naborimet began, his voice taking on the weight of formal pronouncement, "must be understood as preliminary observations requiring careful verification. However, recent reports from multiple cities and kingdoms suggest that we may be witnessing the emergence of some of the warning patterns described in the ancient texts." The astronomer priest who had questioned Enlil Bani earlier reached into a leather satchel and withdrew several small tablets. "These are copies of observational reports I have received from colleagues in 6 different cities over the past year. Each describes unusual phenomena that might normally be dismissed as isolated curiosities. But when considered together, they form a pattern that corresponds closely to sequences described in several of the prophetic texts." He began to read from the tablets, his voice maintaining the careful neutrality of scientific reporting, even as the content became increasingly troubling. The first report described unusual behaviour among migratory birds, with several species arriving at their seasonal destinations either significantly early or late, and some flocks becoming confused about direction, flying in circles for days before finally continuing their journeys. The second tablet documented weather anomalies, observed by farmers across a wide geographical area. The usual patterns of seasonal rainfall had become erratic, with some regions experiencing drought during months that normally brought abundant precipitation, while other areas suffered from flooding during periods that should have been dry. The disruptions were not severe enough to cause widespread crop failures, but they were consistent enough to be noticed by people whose livelihoods depended on understanding natural cycles. A third report, this one from astronomers who maintained careful records of celestial observations, described subtle but persistent anomalies in the positions of certain stars. The changes were so slight that they might have been attributed to errors in measurement, except that multiple observers in different locations had recorded identical discrepancies. Even more puzzling, some familiar constellations appeared to be gradually shifting their shapes, as if individual stars were slowly moving away from their traditional positions. As these reports were read, Enlil Bani felt a growing sense of unease. Each individual observation was the sort of minor irregularity that occurred occasionally in any complex natural system, but their simultaneous occurrence across such a wide area, combined with their correspondence to patterns described in the ancient prophecies, created a cumulative effect that was genuinely disturbing. "There is more," said the foreign scholar, introducing himself as Shamash Hazir, an archive keeper from the Great Library at Mari. "Our historical research has revealed that similar patterns of anomalies have been documented at several points in the past. In each case, they preceded periods of significant social and political disruption." He produced another set of tablets, these ones containing historical chronicles from various periods. The accounts described sequences of events that began with the same types of natural anomalies currently being observed: confused animal migrations, erratic weather, astronomical irregularities. In each case, these initial signs had been followed by more serious disruptions: crop failures, political instability, the collapse of trade networks, sometimes even the fall of entire dynasties. "The correlation is not perfect," Shamash Hazir acknowledged. "Not every period of natural anomalies led to major catastrophes, but the reverse pattern holds consistently. Every major catastrophe in our historical records was preceded by periods of increasing natural irregularities, very similar to what we are observing now." One of the younger scholars in the group, a man perhaps 10 years older than Enlil-Bani himself, raised a question that had been forming in the young scribe's mind. But how can we distinguish between genuine warning signs and the natural tendency to see patterns where none exist? Surely in any given year, careful observers can find some phenomena that deviate from the expected norms. This question prompted a lengthy discussion about methodology and standards of evidence. The assembled scholars had clearly given considerable thought to this problem, and they had developed systematic approaches to distinguish between meaningful anomalies and random variations. Their methods involved comparing current observations not just to recent conditions, but to long-term historical averages compiled from centuries of record keeping. More significantly, they had established networks of communication among observers in different cities and kingdoms, allowing them to verify that unusual phenomena were genuinely widespread rather than merely local curiosities. The consistency of reports from widely separated locations provided strong evidence that the current anomalies represented real changes in natural patterns rather than observational errors or wishful thinking. As the morning progressed, the discussion moved from documentation of current observations to consideration of their implications. If the pattern correlations were accurate, and if the historical precedents were reliable guides, then the current period of natural anomalies might indeed herald more serious disruptions in the years ahead. But the timing and severity of such disruptions remained completely unpredictable. This uncertainty is precisely why the preservation project has become urgent, Naburimet explained to Enlil-Bani. If we are entering a period of potential instability, then the systematic preservation of knowledge becomes not merely an academic exercise, but a crucial responsibility to future generations. The apocalyptic collection that Enlil-Bani had been copying was apparently only one component of a much larger preservation effort. Other scribes in Babylon and elsewhere were working to create comprehensive copies of legal codes, technical manuals, historical chronicles, and religious texts. The goal was to ensure that essential knowledge would survive even if current institutions were disrupted or destroyed. But the preservation project went beyond simple copying. The scholars had also been working to create what they called survival archives, condensed collections of the most essential knowledge needed to maintain basic civilization. These archives included information about agriculture, construction, medicine, and governance, organized in ways that would be accessible to people who might lack extensive education or specialized training. The ancient prophecies serve as both warning and guide, explained one of the elder scholars. They remind us that all human achievements are temporary, but they also provide examples of how knowledge can be preserved across periods of disruption. Many of the texts you have been copying were themselves preserved through earlier catastrophes by scribes who understood the importance of maintaining continuity. This perspective helped Enlil-Bani understand why his work had felt so significant despite its seemingly routine nature. Each symbol he pressed into clay was part of humanity's ongoing effort to remember itself, to maintain the accumulated wisdom that distinguished civilization from barbarism. The apocalyptic prophecies he was copying represented not just ancient fears, but active instructions for preserving hope in the face of uncertainty. As the formal part of the gathering drew to a close, several of the scholars approached Enlil-Bani individually to discuss specific aspects of his copying work. They were particularly interested in texts that described methods for recognizing and responding to early warning signs, and they asked detailed questions about the analytical frameworks he had encountered in the more sophisticated prophetic works. These conversations revealed that the preservation project was not entirely passive. While the scholars could not prevent natural disasters or political upheavals, they believed that careful observation and preparation could significantly reduce the damage such events might cause. Communities that understood the warning signs and had prepared accordingly might weather catastrophes that would destroy less prepared neighbours. Knowledge is the greatest form of wealth, Shamash Hazir told him, as the gathering began to disperse. Unlike gold or grain, it cannot be stolen or consumed, and unlike monuments or buildings, it can survive even the complete destruction of the civilization that created it, as long as someone takes responsibility for preserving and transmitting it. As the scholars departed, returning to their various institutions and responsibilities, Enlil-Bani found himself alone with Nabu-Rimmut in the library that had become the centre of his world. The elderly librarian studied him with the careful attention of someone evaluating whether a student was ready for more advanced instruction. Chapter 6. Preserving the Knowledge. Midday Transcriptions. The weeks following the scholars' gathering brought a fundamental change in the rhythm of Enlil-Bani's work. No longer was he simply copying ancient tablets in the methodical manner of routine preservation. Instead, he found himself at the centre of an intricate network of scholarly correspondence, receiving and dispatching clay tablets that carried observations, calculations and analyses from cities across the known world. Each morning now began with the arrival of messenger tablets, small clay documents sealed with the marks of various institutions and individual scholars. These communications brought updates on the continuing pattern of natural anomalies, requests for specific information from the apocalyptic archives, and collaborative efforts to refine the methods used to interpret prophetic patterns. The library itself had been quietly reorganised to accommodate this increased activity. Additional workstations had been established along the walls, each equipped with the tools needed for rapid copying and analysis. Nabu-Rimmut had recruited 2 additional scribes to assist with the correspondence, men whose skills in ancient scripts and mathematical calculation complemented Enlil-Bani's growing expertise in apocalyptic literature. On this particular morning, the work table before Enlil-Bani was covered with tablets representing 3 distinct types of scholarly activity. To his left lay the continuing series of ancient apocalyptic texts that still required copying for the preservation archive. In the centre sat a collection of recent observational reports that needed to be analysed and correlated with historical patterns. To his right were drafts of summary documents being prepared for distribution to other institutions participating in the preservation project. The challenge of managing these multiple responsibilities had taught Enlil-Bani to organise his time with unprecedented precision. The morning hours, when his mind was freshest and the library quietest, were devoted to the delicate work of copying the most ancient and fragile texts. The middle part of the day was reserved for analytical work, comparing recent observations with historical precedents, identifying patterns that might not be immediately obvious to individual observers, and preparing reports that synthesized information from multiple sources. The afternoon hours were spent on correspondence and collaborative projects, activities that required frequent consultation with other scholars and careful attention to the protocols that governed scholarly communication between different cities and institutions. Each type of work demanded different skills and different levels of concentration, and Enlil-Bani had learned to shift his focus smoothly from one task to another as the day progressed. Today's most urgent task involved analysing a series of reports that had arrived over the past week from agricultural observers in regions surrounding Babylon. These reports described crop behaviours that were unprecedented in the experience of farmers whose families had worked the same fields for generations. Barley plants were producing seeds at irregular intervals, sometimes flowering twice in a single season, other times failing to flower at all despite otherwise healthy growth. Date palms, normally among the most reliable of food sources, were showing similar irregularities. Some trees were producing fruit out of season, while others were dropping their fruit before it reached maturity. Most puzzling of all, some palm groves were producing fruit that looked normal, but tasted bitter, and provided little nourishment, as if the trees were going through the motions of fertility without achieving its substance. These agricultural anomalies were particularly troubling because they corresponded closely to patterns described in several of the ancient apocalyptic texts. One tablet from the Northern Kingdom spoke explicitly of the time when the earth grows confused about its purposes, when plants forget the seasons of their fruiting, and the soil loses its memory of how to nourish. As Enlil-Bani worked through the agricultural reports, comparing them point by point with the ancient prophecies, he was struck by the precision of the correspondence. The prophetic texts were not vague generalities about disaster, but specific descriptions of exactly the types of phenomena now being observed. It was as if the ancient scribes had witnessed these same patterns during earlier periods of disruption and had recorded their observations for the benefit of future generations who might encounter similar conditions. The implications were sobering. If the agricultural anomalies continue to develop along the lines described in the ancient texts, the next stage would involve more serious disruptions, widespread crop failures, shortage of basic food supplies, and the social tensions that inevitably accompanied periods of scarcity. Such conditions had historically led to population movements, political instability, and sometimes the collapse of entire kingdoms. But the ancient text also provided guidance about responses that might mitigate these threats. Several tablets describe techniques for preserving grain during periods of abundance, methods for identifying alternative food sources when traditional crops failed, and strategies for maintaining social cohesion during times of stress. These practical recommendations were interwoven with the prophetic descriptions, suggesting that the ancient scribes had intended their work to serve as both warning and instruction manual. Working with careful attention to detail, Enlil-Bani began preparing a comprehensive analysis that would correlate the current agricultural reports with the relevant ancient prophecies and their associated recommendations. This document would be copied and distributed to other cities participating in the preservation project, providing them with information that might help their own communities prepare for potential challenges. The work required him to consult numerous reference tablets, checking the accuracy of his interpretations and ensuring that his analysis reflected the full range of available evidence. The library's collection included agricultural manuals from different periods and regions, astronomical texts that described the relationship between celestial cycles and earthly fertility, and historical chronicles that documented how various kingdoms had responded to similar challenges in the past. As he worked through these reference materials, Enlil-Bani began to appreciate the extraordinary sophistication of the knowledge preservation system he had become part of. The ancient scholars who had created the apocalyptic archive had not simply collected random prophecies, but had systematically gathered information that would be needed to understand and respond to cyclical patterns of natural disruption. The collection included not just descriptions of catastrophic events, but detailed accounts of how communities had successfully survived such events. There were tablets describing emergency food distribution systems, methods for maintaining public order during periods of scarcity, techniques for preserving essential knowledge when normal educational institutions were disrupted, and strategies for rebuilding infrastructure after periods of destruction. This practical knowledge was as carefully preserved as the more dramatic prophetic visions, suggesting that the ancient scholars had understood preparation to be as important as prediction. They had recognized that even accurate warnings about future difficulties would be useless unless accompanied by concrete guidance about effective responses. The afternoon brought a new challenge in the form of an urgent message from Shamash Hazir, the scholar from Mari who had participated in the recent gathering. His tablet reported astronomical observations that were even more troubling than the agricultural anomalies. 3 different groups of star watchers had independently observed the same phenomenon, the appearance of what seemed to be a new star in a constellation that had remained unchanged throughout recorded history. The new star was not dramatically bright, and casual observers would probably not notice it among the thousands of other points of light that filled the night sky. But to trained astronomers who knew the traditional patterns by heart, its presence was unmistakable. More disturbing still, careful measurements suggested that the new star was gradually growing brighter, as if it were somehow moving closer to the Earth or increasing in its own luminosity. This observation was particularly significant because several of the most sophisticated apocalyptic texts had predicted the appearance of new celestial bodies as a sign of approaching cosmic disruption. One tablet from the Eastern Kingdoms described in detail how a new light would appear among the eternal stars, growing stronger each night until it rivaled the brightness of the moon, herald of the time when heaven and earth would forget their ancient boundaries. Enlil-Bani found himself working with increasing urgency as he prepared a response to Shamash Hazir's report. The astronomical observations needed to be correlated not just with the ancient prophecies, but with the agricultural anomalies and other unusual phenomena that were being reported from across the known world. If multiple types of warning signs were indeed appearing simultaneously, then the timeline for potential major disruptions might be significantly shorter than anyone had previously estimated. The complexity of this analysis required him to collaborate closely with the other scribes who'd been assigned to the preservation project. Together, they created detailed charts that tracked the various types of anomalies across both time and geography, looking for patterns that might reveal the underlying mechanisms driving the unusual phenomena. Their work revealed several disturbing correlations. The agricultural anomalies were most severe in regions that also reported the highest frequency of astronomical irregularities. Areas that had experienced unusual weather patterns were more likely to report disruptions in animal migration routes. Most troubling of all, the intensity of all these phenomena seemed to be increasing gradually but steadily, suggesting that whatever was causing them was gaining strength rather than diminishing. As the day progressed toward evening, Enlil Bani found himself working by lamplight to complete the urgent correspondence required by these new developments. Messages needed to be sent to multiple cities warning them about the potential significance of the new star and requesting their own astronomical observations for correlation and verification. But perhaps more importantly, he needed to prepare recommendations for practical preparations that communities might undertake based on the emerging pattern of warning signs. The ancient texts suggested that the current anomalies might be early indicators of more serious disruptions that could develop over the coming months or years. If this interpretation was correct, then careful preparation during the current period of relative stability could make the difference between survival and catastrophe when more serious challenges emerged. Working by the flickering light of oil lamps as darkness settled over the city, Enlil Bani drafted a series of practical recommendations based on his analysis of the ancient survival manuals. Communities should begin systematically preserving grain and other non-perishable food supplies. Local administrators should review and strengthen their procedures for maintaining order during periods of stress. Scholars and teachers should create multiple copies of essential knowledge and distribute them to various locations to ensure survival, even if individual libraries or schools were destroyed. Most importantly, communities should establish communication networks that would allow them to share information about developing conditions and coordinate their responses to challenges that might affect multiple regions simultaneously. The preservation project itself provided a model for this type of collaboration, demonstrating how scholars from different cities could work together to address problems that transcended local boundaries. As he sealed the last of the evening's correspondence tablets, pressing his personal mark into the clay, alongside the official seal of the temple library, Enlil Bani reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since he had first begun copying the apocalyptic collection. What had started as a routine preservation assignment had evolved into participation in a network of scholarly collaboration that spanned the known world. But the most profound change was in his understanding of the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. The ancient scribes whose work he was preserving had not been passive observers of catastrophic events, but active participants in humanity's ongoing effort to survive and maintain civilization in the face of periodic challenges. Their prophecies were not fatalistic predictions of inevitable doom, but warnings intended to inspire preparation and collaborative response. Now he found himself carrying forward this same tradition, using the knowledge preserved by previous generations to help his own communities prepare for challenges that might not fully emerge for years to come. It was a responsibility that required both scholarly precision and practical wisdom, both careful analysis of ancient patterns and creative thinking about contemporary applications. Yet as he prepared to leave the library for another night of restless sleep filled with dreams of rising waters and falling stars, Enlil Bani could not escape the growing conviction that time was running short. The warning signs described in the ancient texts were appearing with increasing frequency and intensity, suggesting that the period of preparation might be shorter than anyone had hoped. tomorrow would bring new observations, new correlations, and new challenges to his growing understanding of the patterns that governed both catastrophe and survival. Chapter 7. The Legacy of Understanding. Twilight Reflections. The seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, and Enlil-Beni found himself marking the passage of time, not by the familiar cycle of floods and harvests, but by the gradual accumulation of evidence that the world he had known was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to change. 3 full years had passed since he first encountered the apocalyptic collection, and in that time, the patterns described in the ancient texts had continued to manifest with a consistency that was both remarkable and deeply troubling. The morning brought news that had become all too familiar: another messenger tablet from a distant city, another report of phenomena that would have been dismissed as curiosities in earlier times but now formed part of an unmistakable pattern. This particular message came from the far northern territories, where winter had arrived nearly a full month earlier than anyone could remember, bringing with it snows so heavy that entire villages had been cut off from contact with the outside world. Enlil-Beni read the report with the calm attention of someone who had learned to recognise the significance of details that might seem trivial to casual observers. The early winter was troubling enough, but the specific description of snow that fell in unusual patterns, spiralling downward in tight circles rather than the normal straight descent, matched exactly a phenomenon described in one of the oldest tablets in the collection, a text that spoke of the time when even the sky forgets its proper movements. As he added this latest report to the comprehensive archive he had been maintaining, Enlil-Beni reflected on how his understanding of his work had evolved over the years. What had begun as a simple copying assignment had gradually revealed itself to be participation in one of humanity's most ancient and essential activities: the preservation and transmission of knowledge across generations. The archive he now maintained filled an entire section of the library, with tablets organised according to a complex system that allowed rapid cross-reference between historical accounts, contemporary observations, and practical recommendations. Other scholars from across the known world regularly consulted this archive, and copies of key documents had been distributed to libraries in dozens of cities, ensuring that the knowledge would survive even if any single institution was destroyed. But the true measure of the project's success was not the number of tablets copied, or the geographic extent of the preservation network. Instead, it lay in the quiet confidence that had gradually emerged among the participating scholars, the knowledge that they had done everything possible to prepare their communities for whatever challenges might emerge from the patterns they were documenting. The early warning system they had developed had already proven its value on several occasions. Communities that had received advance notice of unusual weather patterns had been able to adjust their planting schedules to minimise crop losses. Cities that had been warned about potential earthquake activity had strengthened their most vulnerable buildings and prepared emergency supplies. Trade networks had been modified to reduce dependence on routes that might be disrupted by the increasing frequency of floods and storms. Most importantly, the preservation project had created a new generation of scholars who understood their work not as abstract academic exercise, but as active service to the continuity of civilization itself. Young scribes in cities across the known world were being trained not just to copy text accurately, but to recognise the patterns that connected past experiences with present challenges and future possibilities. Enlil-Beni had become one of the senior figures in this network, his expertise in apocalyptic literature making him a valued consultant for scholars grappling with unusual phenomena in their own regions. His careful documentation of pattern correlations had helped establish the methodological standards that governed the entire preservation project, and his practical recommendations had been implemented by communities facing the early stages of the disruptions described in the ancient texts. Yet as he worked through the morning hours, adding the latest observations to his ever-growing archive, Enlil-Beni was acutely aware that the most significant aspects of his work might not become apparent for generations. The true test of the preservation project would come not during the relatively mild disruptions currently being observed, But during the more serious challenges that the ancient pattern suggested might still lie ahead, the scholars had learned to think in terms of timescales that stretched far beyond individual lifetimes. The cycles described in the apocalyptic text operated over periods of decades or even centuries, and the current anomalies might represent only the earlier stages of changes that would continue to develop long after everyone now living had passed away. This long-term perspective required a kind of faith, not religious faith, but confidence that the work of preserving and transmitting knowledge would continue across generations. As the day progressed toward afternoon, Enlil-Beni received a visit from a young scribe named Marduk-Shapik, barely out of his training period, who had been assigned to learn the methodologies of apocalyptic analysis. The young man's eagerness reminded Enlil-Beni of his own first encounters with the ancient texts, and he found himself taking particular care to explain not just the technical aspects of the work, but its deeper significance. The tablets you will be copying, he told the young scribe as they walked among the shelves that housed the apocalyptic collection, are not simply historical curiosities. They represent the accumulated wisdom of people who face challenges very similar to those we are encountering today. Each symbol pressed into clay by those ancient scribes was an act of faith in the future, a belief that knowledge carefully preserved could help subsequent generations survive and thrive. He showed Marduk-Shapik some of the most significant tablets in the collection, explaining how the seemingly abstract prophecies contained practical guidance that had already proven valuable in responding to contemporary challenges. The flood predictions had helped communities prepare for the increasingly severe inundations that had become common in recent years. The agricultural guidance had enabled farmers to adapt to the changing patterns of seasonal weather. The astronomical observations had provided early warning of the celestial irregularities that were becoming increasingly frequent. But perhaps most importantly, Enlil-Beni continued, these texts teach us that even the most serious challenges are temporary. The world has ended many times, in many different ways, yet human knowledge and human civilization have always found ways to continue. Our work is part of that continuity. The young scribe listened with the intense attention of someone encountering ideas that would shape his understanding of his profession for decades to come. His questions were thoughtful, and demonstrated that he grasped not just the technical aspects of the preservation project, but its broader implications for the relationship between scholarship and social responsibility. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the library floor, Enlil-Beni found himself reflecting on the changes that the preservation project had brought to his own life and perspective. 3 years earlier he had been a competent but unremarkable copyist, skilled in the mechanical aspects of his craft, but largely unaware of the deeper purposes that scholarly work could serve. The encounter with the apocalyptic collection had transformed not just his daily activities, but his understanding of what it meant to be a scholar. He had learned to see his work as part of a conversation that stretched across centuries, a dialogue between past and future conducted through the patient preservation of knowledge in clay. The ancient scribes who had first composed the apocalyptic texts had been responding to challenges in their own time, but they had also been preparing resources for people they would never meet, living in times they could barely imagine. Now he found himself in a similar position, working to preserve and interpret knowledge that might not reach its full usefulness for generations to come. The patterns he was documenting, the methodologies he was developing, the networks of communication he was helping to maintain, all of these would serve their ultimate purpose only if they were faithfully transmitted to future scholars who would face challenges that he could only anticipate in the most general terms. This long-term perspective had given him a deep appreciation for the patience and dedication of the scholars who had preceded him. The apocalyptic collection represented not the work of a few years or even a few decades, but the accumulated effort of many generations of scribes who had each contributed their own observations and insights to a growing body of knowledge. The preservation project was continuing this tradition, but on a scale that would have been impossible for earlier generations. The network of communication between cities and kingdoms allowed for unprecedented coordination of scholarly effort, and the systematic approach to documentation and analysis ensured that valuable insights would not be lost through the casual neglect that had claimed so much knowledge in the past. As evening approached, and the library began to fill with the warm light of oil lamps, Enlil-bene made his way to the section where the oldest tablets in the collection were stored. These ancient documents, some of them dating back to the earliest periods of written language, represented humanity's first attempts to understand and prepare for the cyclical challenges that seemed to be inherent in the nature of existence itself. The clay was hard and dark with age, and the cuneiform symbols were worn smooth by the passage of time and the careful touch of countless scholars who had consulted these texts over the centuries. Yet the knowledge they contained remained as relevant as ever, perhaps more relevant given the increasing frequency of the phenomena they described. One tablet in particular had become especially significant to Enlil-bene's understanding of his work. Written by an anonymous scribe in a time so distant that even its approximate date was uncertain, the text spoke not of specific catastrophes or technical procedures, but of the deeper principles that should guide anyone who undertook the responsibility of preserving knowledge for future generations. The wise scribe, the ancient text proclaimed, writes not for his own time alone, but for times that exist only in possibility. He preserves not only what is known, but what may be needed. He serves not only those who live, but those who are yet to be born. These words had guided Enlil-bene's approach to the preservation project from the beginning, but their meaning had deepened as his experience grew. He had come to understand that effective preservation required more than accurate copying or careful organisation. It demanded a kind of imaginative empathy, an ability to anticipate the needs of people living in circumstances that could only be guessed at. The Apocalyptic Collection succeeded as a preservation project precisely because its creators had understood this principle. They had preserved not just dramatic accounts of catastrophic events, but the mundane details of daily life that would be needed to reconstruct civilization after periods of disruption. They had included not just descriptions of problems, but detailed guidance about solutions. They had documented not just the failures of their own societies, but the innovations and adaptations that had allowed human communities to survive and recover. Now, as he prepared to conclude another day's work in the long project of preservation and understanding, Enlil-bene could see how his own contributions would serve similar purposes for future generations. The methodologies he had developed for correlating ancient patterns with contemporary observations would help subsequent scholars recognize significant changes in their own time. The communication networks he had helped establish would provide models for maintaining scholarly collaboration even during periods of social disruption. Most importantly, the archive he had created would stand as evidence that even in times of uncertainty and change, human knowledge and human wisdom could provide reliable guidance for those willing to seek it out and apply it thoughtfully. In the decades that followed Enlil-bene's initial work with the Apocalyptic Collection, the preservation project grew into an institution that transcended the boundaries of individual cities and kingdoms. The network of scholars that had begun with a few dozen collaborators expanded to include hundreds of institutions across the known world, creating the most comprehensive system of knowledge preservation that humanity had ever achieved. The methodologies developed during those early years of pattern recognition and correlation became standard practices for scholars throughout the region. Young scribes were trained not just in the technical skills of copying and analysis, but in the broader responsibilities that came with serving as guardians of human knowledge. The idea that scholarship was a form of service to future generations became deeply embedded in the educational traditions of the time. The practical applications of the preserved knowledge proved their value repeatedly as the environmental and social changes predicted by the ancient texts continued to unfold. Communities that had access to the apocalyptic archive and understood how to apply its guidance weathered challenges that devastated less prepared neighbours. The early warning systems developed by the Preservation Project saved countless lives and prevented immeasurable suffering. Perhaps most significantly, the Preservation Project established the principle that knowledge belonged not to individual scholars or institutions, but to humanity as a whole. The systematic sharing of information across political and cultural boundaries created unprecedented levels of cooperation among peoples who had previously viewed each other with suspicion or hostility. The scholars who participated in the preservation project, including Enlil Bani himself, underwent profound personal transformations as a result of their work. They began their careers thinking of scholarship as a specialized profession, but they ended with a deep understanding of learning as a fundamental human activity that connected them to both past and future. This shift in perspective influenced not just their professional activities, but their entire approach to life. They learned to see themselves as temporary custodians of knowledge that had been passed down through countless generations and would continue long after their own deaths. This awareness brought both humility and purpose, a recognition that their individual contributions were small but essential parts of a much larger human project. The communities they served were transformed as well. Populations that had previously lived with little awareness of historical patterns or future possibilities began to develop what might be called historical consciousness, an understanding of their place in longer sequences of change and continuity. This awareness made them more resilient in the face of challenges and more thoughtful about the consequences of their actions. Children growing up during this period learned from an early age that they were inheritors of ancient wisdom and potential contributors to future knowledge. Educational practices evolved to emphasize not just the acquisition of specific skills, but the development of judgment and wisdom that would allow each generation to build thoughtfully on the achievements of their predecessors. The preservation project, initiated during Enlil Bani's time, established patterns of scholarly collaboration and knowledge preservation that influenced human civilization for millennia. The idea that important knowledge should be systematically documented, widely distributed, and carefully transmitted across generations became one of the foundational principles of civilized society. The methodologies developed for recognizing and interpreting patterns of change provided models that were later applied to understanding everything from agricultural cycles to political developments. The concept of early warning systems, first applied to natural disasters, eventually expanded to include social and economic phenomena as well. The international networks of scholarly communication that grew out of the preservation project laid important groundwork for later developments in diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. The habit of cooperation across political boundaries for the sake of shared knowledge created precedents that helped reduce conflict and increase mutual understanding among diverse peoples. Most profoundly, the preservation project helped establish the principle that human beings have responsibilities not just to their immediate communities and contemporaries, but to future generations they will never meet. This expanded sense of temporal obligation became one of the distinguishing characteristics of mature civilizations, influencing everything from environmental stewardship to educational investment. The work begun by Enlil Bani and his colleagues represented what might be called a quiet revolution in human consciousness. Without dramatic battles or political upheavals, they fundamentally changed how people understood their relationship to time and knowledge. They demonstrated that ordinary individuals working with patience and dedication could make contributions that would influence the course of human development for centuries. Their example inspired countless subsequent generations of scholars, teachers, and knowledge workers who understood their daily activities as contributions to the great human project of learning and preservation. Libraries, schools, and universities became not just institutions for current education, but sacred spaces where the wisdom of the past was maintained for the benefit of the future. The apocalyptic collection itself continued to serve its intended purpose long after the specific challenges that inspired its creation had passed. New generations of scholars found in it not just historical information, but timeless insights into the patterns that govern change and continuity in human affairs. The texts that had begun as warnings about specific catastrophes evolved into general guidance about resilience and adaptation. Even today, in our own time of rapid change and uncertainty, the principles established by those ancient preservation projects remain relevant. The idea that knowledge carefully gathered and thoughtfully preserved can help communities navigate challenges. The recognition that patterns from the past can provide guidance for understanding present circumstances. The conviction that ordinary people, working together with patience and dedication, can make contributions that will benefit generations they will never know. In the end, Enlil Bani's story became itself a kind of preserved knowledge, passed down through the very traditions he had helped to strengthen. His careful documentation of apocalyptic patterns, his development of analytical methodologies, his contributions to scholarly networks, all of these became part of the accumulated wisdom that subsequent generations inherited and built upon. The young scribe who had once approached the ancient tablets with nervous uncertainty had become an elder whose own insights were preserved in clay for future scholars to study and apply. His personal transformation from copyist to scholar to teacher to wisdom keeper reflected the broader transformation of human consciousness that the Preservation Project had fostered. Like the ancient scribes whose work he had devoted his life to copying and understanding, Enlil Bani had learned that the true measure of a life well lived was not personal achievement or recognition, but contribution to the continuity of human knowledge and wisdom. His legacy lived not in monuments or titles, but in the countless future scholars who would benefit from the methodologies he had developed and the knowledge he had helped to preserve. In the quiet hours of dawn and twilight, when the eternal rhythms of earth and sky seemed most apparent, the accumulated wisdom of generations whispered its patient message, that knowledge carefully tended grows stronger with time, that wisdom shared multiplies rather than diminishes, and that the careful work of preservation and transmission ensures that each human generation begins not from nothing, but from the rich foundation of everything that has been learned before